So thanks so much for to everybody for coming. The purpose of this specific forum is to define and explain the zoning tool and processes used to develop the conservation overlay districts, to learn how Highland United Neighbors implemented their plan and engaged the neighbors, and to get a perspective of what is working and what is not working for neighborhood organizations. We have 3 panelists. Sarah Showalter from CPD, she's a citywide planning manager. Tim Burrs from Highland United Neighbors. He is a resident and architect who led the COD for HUNI. And most people probably know Rafael Espinoza, former City Councilman, District 1, planning consultant, and past INC board member. So thanks so much. This is really exciting. Yeah, I think we should. So house rules. We ask that everybody be respectful of the panelists and those people asking questions. This is just the first of several forums, I think, on conservation overlays. Sarah will have 10 minutes to present slides. Tim and Rafael will have 5 minutes. We do have a timekeeper, Jane, for a 1-minute mark. To the audience, there are index cards. Please write 1 question per card. If there are topics, we will group them together. We're going to try to get through all the questions. And INC will be sending out a survey afterwards. And if you would like to fill it out, please make sure you've signed in. I think that's it. So Sarah.
Sure. I have a few slides up here, so thanks for the introduction, Blair. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm gonna, just so I don't forget, because I have to scoot out of here right at 11, I have some handouts I'll leave up on this table if people are interested. One is an overview of conservation overlays and some basics about the process for them, and then the other stack is just hard copies of the slides I'm gonna walk through, so feel free to grab those if you want when you're on your way out. So first thing I wanted to explain is that conservation overlays are part of the zoning code, and just to make sure we're all on the same page, zoning is the rules and regulations that govern what you can build on your property. They are only for private property, so it's not what's in the public right-of-way, which includes streetscaping. Zoning regulates the private land, and we use zoning to implement the vision and policy in our plans, but zoning is actual rules and regulations, not plan itself, and so it's much more technical and much more about the very specific land use and built form regulations on what you can actually put on your property. So conservation overlays live in the zoning code. They are a zoning tool, and they are designed to encourage conservation of very unique features in an area that makes that area special, and there's a reason that we want to try and make sure the zoning is enabling and preserving those unique features. So the way overlays work is that they work on top of a base zone district. So they don't change what your primary zoning is. All the properties in Denver have a zoning district. For residential neighborhoods, you're probably used to seeing things like a USU, which stands for the urban context single unit, or an ETU, which is urban edge, 2 unit for the TU. So that it would be like examples of what the base zoning might be, and then the overlay works on top of that. So most of your zoning would still be in your base zoning, and the overlay is kind of a tool that we can use to tweak a few things that might not be working with the base zoning, given some of the unique character components of that particular neighborhood. And I'll give an example of what that might look like in a minute. But before we get into examples of conservation overlays, did want to clarify that they are one tool that you can use, but there are other tools if you're interested in looking at character and design issues in your neighborhood. So one you're probably aware of is we have the tool to do historic districts, and that is a real preservation tool. It's the only tool, it does not live in the zoning code, it is a separate process. but it's the only tool you can use to prevent demolition, for example, and is really about preserving the historic character of a neighborhood. We have a lot of preservation districts in Denver, and it is, if you're really thinking about trying to preserve a certain pattern or character of a historic area, then that is one tool. Conservation overlays, like I said, they're different than a historic district because they are a zoning tool. They cannot prevent demolition, but they can encourage, through tweaks in the zoning, ways of preserving and promoting certain aspects of how houses are designed to really fit that area. We also have design overlays, which are very similar to conservation overlay in terms of process and how they work. It's just the intent of them is a little different. Conservation overlays are for areas that already have a found pattern or something that's been there for a while that you're really trying to conserve. Design overlays really are about trying to get a desired character for a newly developing area, or an area where it's not necessarily about reflecting kind of past character like a conservation overlay. So this is just a little summary of kind of the difference between them. Design overlays don't necessarily have to be in new areas, but it might just be you're really trying to improve the design outcomes, and the focus is more on the future and less about a found pattern. Conservation overlays are much more about something that's already there and you want to make sure it continues. And then obviously historic districts would be really about preserving a very specific character in an area. So an example of a conservation overlay, there's a few that already exist in Denver and been adopted into the zoning code. One is in Curtis Park. That one is all about recognizing that compared to a lot of other neighborhoods that have similar zoning as Curtis Park, they have larger detached accessory structures, a kind of catch-all term in the zoning code for things like garages, which is accessory to the main house, or an accessory dwelling unit like a granny flat, which is accessory to the main house. In Curtis Park, they needed basically more flexibility because they had a pattern of bigger garages and bigger ADUs than the zoning was allowing. So this conservation overlay gives them that flexibility given that pattern in their neighborhood. Potter Highlands is another example. That's one that Tim worked extensively on, so and is certainly the expert. But again, it's about providing some flexibility from what the base zone district was in that area to acknowledge some of the really interesting, unique features of that neighborhood, including the ability to do, for example, dormers on the side of the roof. The base zoning wasn't allowing for that, as well as some flexibility, or actually I shouldn't say flexibility, as well as actually getting more specific about 5-foot required side setback, and changing how the bulk plane was measured so that the infill that was happening was more appropriate with the existing structures in the neighborhood. So quickly on process, overlays, they are a text amendment to the Denver zoning code. All of those have to be approved by city council. They are typically initiated by a Denver city council member. So a neighborhood plays a very important role in creating the support and identifying the goals for what you want to get out of an overlay, and then working on all the outreach that needs to happen to get consensus around what the big issues are and how to address them with your community. And the council office can be really helpful in supporting that. And then they would be the one that actually are the bill sponsor to bring it when it's ready to get adopted by city council. I did want to emphasize it's a lot of work. We typically have seen 2 to 3 years. Some of the overlays that are being discussed right now have actually even been going on longer than that, just because sometimes it can be really difficult to get consensus around what exactly should change in the zoning, because it's rule, it's law, so once it's adopted, then that's it. And sometimes there's also confusion around in a neighborhood around, well, do we want to be a historic district, or do we want to be a conservation overlay, because they are very different tools. And as you can imagine, a lot of outreach and time goes into getting a lot of thought around those topics. And then you also need the time to actually draft the solutions, which our staff, planners in the CPD office, can play a big role throughout the process in helping you figure it all out, but then especially in some of the technical drafting. So if you're interested in an overlay, I think a really key thing to do is to talk to your city council office. You can certainly reach out to our department. And start exploring, again, making sure you kind of understand some of the basics I talked about, just what are the different tools available to you, what are your goals, and what are you trying to achieve, and we can help figure out what might be the best fit. Once you kind of get into it being a conservation overlay, then a really important thing is actually documenting and understanding what are the distinctive characteristics that you're trying to conserve. So is it about a particular form that you see in most of the houses, and then some of the infill coming in just isn't fitting that? A lot of it is identifying exactly what the found patterns are, and then understanding what in the base zoning is not jiving with that, so that it can be fixed through the overlay. And then, like I mentioned, there's a lot of what takes so much time is developing the potential solutions and getting the community feedback. And that includes testing proposed options to make sure you aren't creating unintended outcomes, getting lots of feedback. And then, like I mentioned, CPD staff and number 3 there can actually help with the drafting. And then you go into public adoption process, which is a public hearing in front of planning board and then city council. And my last parting message I wanted to tell everybody is we think one of the reasons we see such high demand for both conservation overlays and design overlays is because a lot of the base zoning standards for all of our residential neighborhoods are not working right now. So during Blueprint Denver, I know it came and presented to INC a lot, so I know a lot of you, but hopefully all of you were aware of this process and engaged. And one of the biggest things we heard from the community during that planning process was that they wanted better design in their neighborhoods. And we agree, there's a lot of out of context infill happening in neighborhoods. And that is largely because you can't necessarily address all of it through zoning with some of the concerns that came up, but most of it is about zoning standards such as the bulk that you're allowed to do with the bulk plane, the maximum height, the lot coverage, whether you have a porch or any kind of windows on the front of the home, the setbacks, all those things are zoning tools. And so we are planning to kick off a project next year that would across all of the context, so all the neighborhoods in Denver from suburban to urban edge to urban, change those base zoning requirements. And we're very hopeful that we'll get at a lot, because a lot of common themes are coming up with the overlays that relate to some of the things I just said, bulk, setbacks, all that kind of stuff. So we fix it in the base zoning, then it reduces the need to do these individualized overlays throughout the city. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Good morning. Again, I'm Tim Burse. I chair the Land Use Committee, which is called the Planning and Community. Good morning. Is that better? Real close. Okay. I'm Tim Burse. I chair the Planning and Community Development Committee, PCD Committee, which is the Land Use Committee for Highland United Neighbors, Inc. And we like to pronounce it HUNI, so therefore our newsletter is the Honeybee and so forth. Anyway, our committee worked with the city during the process to come up with the new zoning code that was adopted in 2010. And so we worked on that for years leading up to that and really got to understand what the needs were in our neighborhood. Unfortunately, the new zoning code as adopted, as Sarah's just mentioned, doesn't quite get everything where it needs to be for our neighborhood. And we recognized that immediately. The goal of the zoning code was to have good zoning throughout the city. So we have over 15 different zone districts in Highland. That means that we're a very heterogeneous neighborhood rather than a homogeneous neighborhood. And so there's lots of variety, lots of exceptions. And we found that we were getting lots of variance requests to do things that simply made things fit better into the neighborhood. So one of the big goals behind having overlays was to try to reduce the number of variance requests we had and allow people to design things that fit better into different parts of our neighborhood. So we took the information we had learned and started developing ideas, expressed those to the neighborhood through different events, And then we had developers and architects working in our neighborhood test them so we could see if there were unintended consequences. Once we had things in pretty good shape, we took that to our city council person, Judy Montero at that time, and convinced her to support the process. And then we ended up with public meetings. And we were fortunate in having funding from HUNI that allowed us to send out a postcard to every property owner in the neighborhood, notifying them of the 2 meetings and what the purpose of the meetings were. And so we presented everything to the neighborhood and got feedback, and a month later came back with revisions and provided that. And at that point then had support from Judy and took it to CPD. We'd been working with them prior to this, but really gave it to them and said, okay, turn our language into the legal language and the zoning documents. And went through a couple of months of working with them to get the language right, reviewed that, and then through the process. And I think one of the questions you might all have is, so how's it working? We adopted 3 different overlays, 2 conservation overlays, 1 design overlay in 2015. And so we're seeing fewer requests for variances, so that's good. We're seeing new projects in our historic landmark areas, historic non-landmark areas that fit better into our neighborhood. So I think there's a lot of success from that. We do still find that the zoning folks at the city sometimes forget that we have overlays, and so people get cited when they're coming in for a permit that, well, you can't do this, and they come to our neighborhood organization then, and we're able to say, no, actually, tell them to go look at this chapter and straighten that out. So, but otherwise, things are in much better shape than they once were. Thank you.
There we go. So good morning. Thank you, INC, for doing this. So I'm going to be talking to a couple of slides specifically from this Ludi presentation, but it speaks to both what Sarah and Tim just said. This is a long process, and it is a public process. And so because it's a regulatory process, and so your constitutional Fifth Amendment property rights and all that stuff play into it. So one person can't get an idea and shove it down everybody's throat. It has to be an open process at some point before it can ever get through the political process that is going to take, that a council person such as myself when I was in office and my colleagues to actually vote and enact this land use regulation. That said, what I want to emphasize is I know that INC had an NPI, Neighborhood Planning Initiative presentation, and what you heard Sarah say is that the zoning is an implementation of those plans. But you also saw her present a slide that says that this regulatory change could take anywhere from 2 to 3 years. Tim's process actually took closer to 5, correct? And so if you wait for the city to come around and plan your neighborhood, that is a purely advisory thing. And so if they then use that as the impetus for going about with a regulatory change, you're still 2 years down the road from that. So if you live in a community where you do want to make these changes, I highly encourage you to begin doing that work and follow these processes outlined and move and whether you guys ever get to the finish line or your comments start to inform this other process that the city is now undertaking, you're moving that needle faster towards better outcomes. Because what we've known is the one-size-fits-all that was adopted in 2010 did not address the local concerns. The tools were there, that's what we're talking about, to address these sort of hyper-local concerns, but they were never moved on or implemented except for in these one-off situations like they were in Curtis Park, they were in Potter Highland, they are currently going on in Harkness Heights in Northwest Denver, and in Sunnyside and Northwest Denver. Just so you know, yes, I represented Northwest Denver, so from the REI flagship downtown to Inspiration Point up at 52nd and Sheridan. And so that's what I want to talk to you about. That's what I'm going to hit home with these two slides from this presentation last November. Okay? This is a map that shows what statistical neighborhoods, the 78 statistical neighborhoods in Denver, have had plans, had plans at some point in time. It shows the areas in dark purple were plans adopted after 2002. The areas in light purple were adopted prior to 2002. So those are very old plans. The areas in black have never had a plan in the history of Denver. Why this one struck home with me is, I represent Northwest Denver, so that far upper left corner, if you look at that far upper left corner, you see 5 statistical neighborhoods that have never had plans. But those are areas that had experienced wild gentrification and increased activity. And so what was happening is you were grinding up historic streetcar neighborhoods and the character and replacing it with this one-size-fits-all zoning product. And it was getting some really heinous outcomes. And so those areas were sort of clamoring for attention from our city to address these concerns. And that's over the course of the last 9 years. The next slide is the areas that, this NPI process scores and weights areas based on, a whole set of criteria, and it determines what areas need planning. And this is interesting because those areas, 4 of those 5 areas that have never had a plan in the history, scored the absolute lowest in planning need. So, granted, this does not necessarily mean they're going to be dead last in the process of NPI, the 12th year of that process. But if those areas did wait, those areas aren't going to get addressed for a decade with regulatory tools. And so the interesting fact here, based on that scoring system, is if you look at Stapleton, a fully master planned community weights higher than those areas that have never had a plan for planning need. Lowry, even higher. So it's a function of their bureaucratic process. And so if they were to wait, hoping that a plan, an advisory plan, was going to get the regulatory outcomes that will actually drive change in their community, you could be waiting a very long time. So help the city out. Work on your overlays. Do it in an open and public way. Understand that you're all swimming and rowing in the same direction, even though you might have conflicting ideas. Stress compromise. Understand that you're not going to get it right the first time, the 6th time, the 10th time, and that people will come at the 11th hour asking for change, and some of those things might be relevant. But that is the process that each person in council needs, and I can tell you that if a bunch of communities end up doing that, one of my frustrations as a member of council is every year I fought for more money for CPD for this effort. Every year they got more money, but it didn't necessarily go where we wanted it to. Because while we allocate the budget as members of council, we do not dictate how those departments spend it. They put it out there how they intend to, but resources come and go as based on a whole host of vectors that impact the city. Oh, I gotta stop. So bottom line is, once a lot of movement happens in the community, they will put resources to it because they'll have no other choice. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in. There are a lot of questions already. I'm sorry? Oh, they'll be collecting them at the end of the aisles. Okay, so the first question is, new zoning seems to be anything, anywhere, just to build density. How are CODs better or worse than NPI, which is a neighborhood planning initiative? And 1 minute, I'm sorry, yeah, Jane, yes, 1 minute to answer. The question is, new zoning seems to be anything, anywhere, just to build density. How are the conservation overlay districts better or worse than a neighborhood planning initiative? So I think that they're asking, how do they interact?
So it depends on who you are.
Okay.
If you're the developer, you're going to say that NPI is better because it completely gives you sort of vision statements and latitude. If you're in favor of the regulatory tools that are in a COD, then you're going to want that because that has greater predictability. There is nothing in the plan documents that is obligatory. It is purely advisory. Whereas these overlay districts are regulation. You have to comply with them. Or if you want to deviate, you have to get a variance.
I'd add, it's part of why it takes so long to do conservation overlays in most of the areas we're talking about is because there wasn't necessarily a clear plan vision in a current neighborhood plan. So I agree with what the councilman was saying. We're not trying to say you have to wait until you have one, but it can be very helpful to have one. And so I think you're conflating two very different things. MPI is about a vision for a 20-year adopted policy vision for what you want your neighborhood to be. Zoning is one way to implement that vision. So where you do have a current neighborhood plan, then a conservation overlay is a way to implement if you've identified areas that need something special, that need that extra conservation.
Okay, the next question is, can conservation overlay districts be used to address streetscape issues? I think you touched a little bit along the right-of-way, but I'll just say, in particular, could a COD be used to promote tree preservation when existing green canopy of mature trees is identifying characteristic of that neighborhood? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it gets to one of the things, frankly, within the city that can be frustrating sometimes, which is different departments have purview over different things. So CPD, like I mentioned, our zoning is written for the private land, and most of what you think about in terms of streetscape and street trees is in the public land. When it's trees, the city forester plays a really big role. When it's everything else, basically it's public works. So generally the answer is no. If it's stuff that's really in the public right-of-way, conservation overlay is probably not your best tool. You could use a conservation overlay potentially to preserve trees on the private property. And one of the big things that came out of Blueprint Denver, there's many recommendations there, is that we need to do a much better job as a city overall preserving trees, both in the public right-of-way and on private property. Compared to a lot of peer cities, we have very flexible regulations when it comes to tree preservation. And I'd also just note, to help break down some of this, well, what's the forester doing versus CPD versus public works, we have a joint effort going on right now to write complete street guidelines that will hopefully lead to changes in our regulations addressing streetscape. So tools like that are going to be better than a conservation overlay for things happening in the public right away.
Okay, a couple of these are specific to certain panelists. So this one is to Rafael Espinoza. What has happened with the COD in Berkeley in Northwest? I don't know if you have kept in the loop with that.
So
Sure.
I know that you put some money aside to help that neighborhood organization. I can't remember the exact name.
Yeah, Berkeley Regis United Neighbors run that. Our staff's still working on that, so I can help answer that.
Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to.
We're currently working on it. What are you curious about?
I just wanted to know it's still in the works.
Yes, it is. And we also have the current district office one staff here that's helping with that too. Naomi is here if you want to catch her and get more detail.
Okay, the next question is, how is group housing impacted by zoning and conservation overlays? You could probably answer a little bit more about that. We talked a little bit about it in the beginning. They're
Sure.
still, I think, going through. the process?
Well, so to clarify, conservation overlays are really about design features and building form. They're not about the permitted uses allowed on your property. And you actually can't use a conservation overlay to change uses. It's very clear in the code, it's legally not allowed. So group living in the project that came up before, which gets to the permitted uses and defining what those uses are, wouldn't change through a conservation overlay. So they're really not that related. Conservation overlay is about things you can see from outside a house and thinking about its design and context and how it fits into your neighborhood in terms of how it's designed. Group living is about what's happening inside the house.
I'm not going to change anybody's questions, by the way. I'm just going to read them as they come, just so you don't feel like I'm editing anything. Okay. Homeowners' taxes are going up as much as 27% when a McMansion is built next door. Can or will the city revise the property tax codes to protect the affected homeowners, surrounding homeowners, when a McMansion is built next door? Official term, McMansion.
Yeah, well, I think our starting point is we'd like to just stop seeing McMansions that don't fit the character of the neighborhood. So that's really what we were to talk about today in that project that I mentioned. So
That's great.
that's really what the project I mentioned is about. Actually, this is happening across all the neighborhoods in Denver, and it's particularly concerning, right, in ones that already might have residents vulnerable to displacement, where property values are already lower and they're starting to gentrify. So we really want to, across all of Denver, stop seeing the inappropriate infill.
Can I piggyback on that? Because I do want to caution you. So one, you're never going to see me sit there and be a proponent for lower property taxes, because our property taxes are extremely low. And yes, property values go up, your property tax does go up, but not in the same amount because of the Gallagher Amendment. That said, when you put this level of predictability that comes with overlay districts, you will tend to get higher property values. Because of that predictability that people are buying into. I can honestly say that HUNI is the highest dollar neighborhood in Northwest Denver, probably in part due to the level of predictability that comes with the historic districts, conservation overlay, and the design overlay.
And proximity to downtown.
Yes, but it wasn't always the highest value neighbor.
No, it was the lowest one.
Exactly. So it's the confluence of those things. Doing city right makes an area desirable, and Tim has done an outstanding job in Highland. I think we can all agree.
This is a great question just about content of the overlays. How does zoning and planning define distinctive features and character of a neighborhood?
Yeah, that is a great example, or a great question. I don't think it's not necessarily just us defining that. Like, we work with the council office and the community there's a whole range of things. So it can be from, how close is the house to the street or the property? What's the bulk plane that you typically see, the shape of the roof? Are there front porches or not is a big one that's been coming up in some of the overlays we're working on now. So it's really about anything that you see as a common pattern in that neighborhood.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, we actually had students from CU, planning students, assist us in really mapping out what were the characteristics within different parts of our neighborhood, and that was a key piece to figuring out what were all the characteristics that we needed to protect, and then we started defining ways and developing ways to do that through the overlay process.
Good reminder, I should add on that all the successfully adopted overlays have had a design professional, sometimes students and a practicing design professional, sometimes just the latter, help them with the process, because you need that design eye that can identify these are the found defining characteristics, and then also help identify what in the zoning code isn't working. Our staff can help with that as well, but it's really helpful to have those design experts. Sometimes Historic Denver can help pay for that. Sometimes the council office will help pay for that. There's different models, but having students and or design professional do some of that work for you is really helpful, and has been what's where we've seen success with the overlays.
Neighborhood planning initiatives set themselves up as the only thing needed to define a neighborhood, but they are a plan or guide. Conservation overlay districts codify zoning, and the question is that why the city makes it so difficult to get a COD? Maybe you could answer that.
Yeah, well, I guess my opinion is we're trying not to make it difficult to get a conservation overlay. I have a bunch of staff working on that on top of a lot of other things because we want to help communities get them. I think what makes it hard is that it takes a lot of work to get a bunch of property owners in a neighborhood with different opinions about what they want to happen on their property and then get enough support to get your council person to support it. That's the process of changing zoning in Denver. So I think it's less about what the city's doing as a barrier and more about just how challenging it is to have these conversations and get consensus on what the right solutions are.
This one is piggybacking on that for Tim. How was it working with CPD? And probably Rafael could answer that also.
Once we had our homework done, things with CPT were really excellent. The language was written well. They were amenable to edits on our part to make sure that the language was clear and hopefully wouldn't come back to haunt us in the future. So, yeah, I have nothing but good to say for how they worked with us.
It was a tiny bit frustrating, to be honest. But it is going to be a learning, a chance to learn. The reason being is that when we have conversations in the community and we make decisions, it's all in lay terms and we're all in agreement and we have consensus on language, and that's not the language of the code. That's not the language that development services use when they review these things. And so you take the same thing that you just spent months working on, you hand it over to the city and say, translate it. And that's a nine-month process. And that can be extremely frustrating. So I will be observing both, the Harkness Heights, the Brun, the Sunnyside, and seeing what that language ends up looking like, and then highly encourage people going forward to sort of learn from that and try to speak that language throughout your process so that maybe you can be where Tim was and have a much more expedited process when you're finally ready to get it translated into bureaucratic speak. Thanks.
Okay, I have a couple of questions about budget and financing. What if your neighbors want to create an overlay district but don't have the money or somebody to, like a professional to work with? Because you said it's like very intensive. What can the city do to help? Or are there grants? Can the city subsidize them? And are there consultants available?
Those are great questions. And one of the things that Blueprint Denver acknowledges is we need to try and expand our resources for these overlays. Like I said, we also want to fix the base problem so that there aren't so many neighborhoods feeling like they need these tools. So a lot of resources would go into that, but also expanding the resources to help neighborhoods more. Right now, the best, like I mentioned already, the best two sources of funds to get the help from a design professional is to go to your city council office and see if they have able to help with that, or Historic Denver. They tend to be more focused on the areas where it's truly a conservation overlay and about preserving a found pattern because of their mission. But those are the two main places. We've also seen, usually through Historic Denver, and maybe Tim can talk about how they got students involved, bringing in oftentimes graduate level students to help with that as well, which can be free, which is great. So those are the best tips I have about identifying those resources. And we can certainly, between our office and the council offices, we know a lot. There's kind of a small group of design professionals that are standard go-tos for helping with overlays, and so we can help connect you to them.
And I would just add that we were fortunate that HUNI at that time had a farmer's market that was lucrative, and so they actually had money in the bank that they were willing to spend for one professional to assist us late in the game, and for the mailing on the postcards. So we were able to fund it there, but I think that's an unusual situation, honestly.
Back to budget and financing. What is the typical cost for an RNO or a group of neighbors to create the COD?
I think we spent about $8,000 to $10,000 with the professionals and the mailing. The mailing is actually pretty darn expensive. And that's why we had one postcard for 2 meetings. We had to plan ahead. But we had the other advantage of having people on our committee who were design professionals, an attorney, a developer, almost everybody we needed. A graphic designer who really helped us with our graphics.
Yeah, that's gonna, if you're a professional rich in your community and you can get volunteer efforts, that's gonna be the least expensive route. Giving your, showing that there's general momentum and speaking with your council office and sort of preparing them because I think they're obviously gonna want to see consensus built, and they're going to want to see proper outreach so that it's easy to maybe leverage them for the mailings. Depends, but it really depends. So it can be anywhere from that shoestring to considerably more, but it's all over time. So it's more of a sort of a drip process.
Okay, this is a technical question. Can you explain a little bit more, Sarah, about contextual bulk and scale requirements that are included in CODs?
Sure. Well, actually, Tim could also give examples specifically from the overlay he worked on. But yeah, examples would be, well, do you want to talk about, the one that comes to my mind right away is that we changed the height from which we measure the bulk plane first. But if
Yeah, we did a lot of really minor tweaks. So we reduced the height of the bulk plane when you had a pitched roof. We also added a flat roof version that allowed you to go higher near the property lines, but then capped it so that you couldn't build a third story, because we were starting to see third story kinds of things being proposed. We added the dormers if you had a pitched roof, but we pulled the bulk plane down. We tested that so that we ended up with the same amount of buildable area within the volume of the house, but a volume that fit with the character of the neighboring houses. So there were things like that. It's a long list. If you want to go into Chapter 10 of the zoning code, you can read CO4 and CO5 and see exactly what we tweaked.
This sort of related question. Can the Conservation Overlay District address any of the zone designations like single unit or 2 unit? You can't include those.
no, because that's again what I was saying before. How many units are allowed is about the permitted uses, and the overlay is about the design characteristics. So you can't change how many units are permitted through an overlay. Yes, you could change that.
Yeah, but you can have that conversation because ultimately, when you bring forward your overlay, it's a text amendment, and then you'll map it through a map amendment. And so, if there is a discussion and there's a desire for multi-unit in some area or downgrade from a and you have plan support or can make that case, you could also do a separate map amendment and rezone if necessary.
I have a couple of questions about the speed of a development and kind of on the juxtaposition, how long it takes for a neighborhood to get together to do the conservation overlay. Is there any way to slow down development to allow the neighborhoods to get together to do this? Because for every McMansion we get, we lose, what we feel like is an affordable home. How can we heal this kind of time gap? You can't.
A legislative tool You all know the moratorium word. You will get pushback from the city attorney that unless you identify a problem that needs a solution and that you need time to work on that solution, could you justify a temporary moratorium? So even that would take some legwork and take a ton of political will and lobbying of council to convince the city to lock down a particular area. Technically, so the short answer is largely no.
So related to that, if your elected city council person does not support the proposed overlay, can another council person sponsor the application?
Legally, there are 14 people in the city that can move these forward, the 13 members of council. There are 2 at-large candidates and the director of CPD. That said, if you can't get your local council person to support it, the chances of anybody else taking that mantle is nil or close to it. It's technically possible, but highly, highly unlikely in a political world.
Okay, the next question is, this is back to the variances and how this sort of ignited for HUNI. How does an RNO find out what are the most common variance requests in our neighborhood, and where are the properties? Is this like a mapping tool at CPD?
So RNOs are notified of all variance requests. Anything that's going to the Board of Adjustment for zoning comes to each RNO that covers that area. So from that process is how we learned about what do we keep seeing. It's over and over again. Obviously there's a problem, but yeah, it's somewhat anecdotal.
This is a specific neighborhood planning question. How does or where does the conservation overlay relate to, for example, the East Area Plan?
So again, like I mentioned before, they're pretty different things. A plan is a process where you engage the community to say, what do you want the vision for your neighborhood to be, and provide guidance for how you want to see it evolve over the next 20 years. And then you would use a variety of ways of trying to implement that, and a conservation tool is one way to do that. So the best example I can think of is like if you had a neighborhood plan that identified, like we've been doing what we call pattern books as part of our neighborhood plans, and actually Crisana Park, which is one of the neighborhoods that has a conservation overlay, had a pattern book that was done to help inform that. It basically identifies like what I was talking about, like find those unique things about your neighborhood that need to be conserved. So if through a planning process we identified here are some areas that had those unique things, and then we're starting to see new development that's not in line with that, then you'd use a conservation overlay to help implement that part of the plan that says we need to do a better job in that area preserving those components.
I just want to jump back to the prior question about bulk. Crisana Park is a great example of a bulk modification because the standard height of a single family urban house form is 35 feet, and they lowered theirs down to 19 feet is the maximum height of a structure in Crisana Park.
That aligns with, they have primarily one-story ranches in their neighborhood. And so it's a great example of where that standard kind of base zoning, like in a lot of Denver neighborhoods, you can get up to 2.5 stories, and that's where that's coming from. But that was not the found pattern in their neighborhood. So they used the overlay to tweak that because they saw a lot of pop tops happening that were really out of scale.
I have a couple of specific project questions. One of them is about Tennyson. Rafael, can you explain a little bit more about the overlay process there, specifically with the start-stop process that the RNO has been trying to put into place for 4 or 5 years? Can you explain that, please?
So Tennyson, if you've been there, is a real tragedy of a Main Street commercial corridor. it has mixed-use zoning, but what we've seen is a lot of commercial properties get bought up and turned into slot homes, really atrocious slot homes. And even the slot home legislation, is too late for that area. And it's really tragic because Berkeley, the statistical neighborhood there had started a discussion about that probably some 7 years ago and came up with some really good ideas that didn't move forward in the prior administration and barely moved forward in my administration. What we found is probably the quick tool would be to change the zone district to all Main Street, use the new active, the zone districts themselves has changed over the course of these 9 years to sort of get better outcomes. But there were some part of the problems that in doing this is if you don't have consistency in your leadership and your RNOs and the people that are in charge of these things, and consensus there, it can be a hindrance to moving forward. So that said, there is the conversation about Tennyson in particular has changed over time. And that the current, I don't know, I'm not intimately involved in where it is right now, but I know that the current thinking was to sort of try and preserve nodes, to basically say that, look, we have lost wholesale blocks to residential, but let's hold on to corners and make sure that those remain active. And so the consultant architect, Pelona, that we had hired during my time was focused on that, and hopefully the community can move forward on that to sort of preserve the sort of intrinsic, the sort of crucial elements so that you don't lose it all. One of the, and I know I have to stop, but one of the ironic things about, say, 32nd and Lowell, in the Lowell, the Highland Highland Square issue is there's an area that's got 3 historic districts that flank a commercial corridor that has no restrictions or regulatory tools over it. It's a prime candidate for an overlay that would probably mirror something that you'd want to do on, say, Pearl Street, South Pearl Street. There's a distinct possibility that if somebody wanted to, they could go in and grind up all of 32nd Ave in Highland, in West Highland, sorry, and design something completely modern but flanked by 3 historic districts. The only difference you're not seeing what you saw in Tennyson is the lot sizes are smaller and the prices per square foot were higher. So they've been sort of shielded, but they had their first demolition in the last 6 months, and there would be no constraint on what could get developed there as long as it conformed to the MS3 or MX3 zone district, whatever it was. So back to Tennyson Street, sorry, it is still in discussion, but until the leadership over there gets rowing in the same direction and coalesces around a particular idea, you will still see it stymied by the lack of consensus. And that's why I keep saying you have to work towards consensus. You have to be willing to make compromises. Otherwise, you will watch the status quo run roughshod over you. Thanks.
Sorry, I just want to add one quick thing on what you said. It made me realize a theme I wanted to make sure to mention today is do not forget about historic districts. If you don't want to see buildings demolished, that is your tool. If there's true, I think, 32nd Lowell is great. You're saying it's flanked by a historic district. Like the historic district could extend into the commercial area. A conservation overlay is a great tool, but it can only do so much. And where Tim was, at least part of what was covered, they have a historic district and the overlay working together. So don't forget about that tool. We've seen a lot of communities, I think, shy away from historic preservation because a lot of property rights conversations come up, but it is the best tool for truly preserving the character of an area.
we have so many really great questions that we're going to limit the number that come in now. So if you have any last thoughts, please write them down. The next question is, considering that Denver is in a housing affordability crisis, how can a COD be used to encourage more supply of housing to meet the rising demand? I fear that COD will only make affordability worse, especially as you said, it increases property value.
Let me take a stab at this, because that certainly has been one of the great challenges for Highland is we've had gentrification beyond anyone's wildest dreams on either side of that fence. We specifically tried with the overlays to do things that allowed houses to be expanded within a landmark district in ways that wouldn't harm the landmark district, but would allow families to stay in our neighborhood and not sell and leave and head to the suburbs. So I'm not sure it addresses the affordability thing quite, but if you've already bought the house and you're there and you can stay there, that makes a big difference. In Scottish Village, where I live, we have very small lots, and we work to actually expand how much could be built on properties within the forms that were there historically, so that again people could expand and make things more livable, so that we still have family housing, rather than wholesale demolition.
I'd just add, so during Blueprint Denver, it was really interesting. In addition to hearing people that they want better design in their neighborhoods, there were a lot of neighborhoods who also expressed a desire to see more housing options and gentle density in appropriate areas if it was designed well, is the huge caveat, right? So a lot of openness to maybe having duplexes or even up to fourplexes on large lots if it's designed well and they preserve the existing structure as part of that instead of scraping it. So part of what we're going to look at with the residential infill project I mentioned is how can we improve design but also look for opportunities to integrate more housing options into our neighborhoods. So a conservation overlay alone couldn't do that, but through these bigger zoning code changes, we have more flexibility to look at design as well as how many units can fit on the lot together.
We have a couple of questions specifically about that. What is being proposed specifically as far as adjustments to the zone code, and as far as how Blueprint Denver guides those changes?
Nothing's being proposed yet. We don't, it's just a project that's coming next year. So we'll spend a lot of time surveying all of the neighborhoods out there, looking at what's getting built and where we've seen and heard that it's so out of context, and identifying, and testing kind of, well, what is it in the zoning code that's allowing those things to happen? And then based on that is when you start developing solutions. And we'd have a very robust community input process as part of that project. So right now there are no proposals on the table. We'll use Blueprint Denver. That's exactly what it's there for. Like I was saying, plans are to guide the regulations and the implementation. So Blueprint Denver identified a lot of things that people were concerned about in terms of design in their residential neighborhoods. So we'll use that. We'll also use what we're hearing from neighborhoods throughout the city during the process to help inform what the solutions should be.
I have two yes/no questions. The first is, can a COD limit the size of a building's footprint?
Yes.
And how can a conservation overlay include a land trust? I don't know that.
It's not really relevant. Like a land trust is just is about who owns property. Zoning doesn't govern that at all. So I guess the answer is yes, because a COD just doesn't have anything to do with that. So it wouldn't preclude you from doing a land trust.
I have a couple of questions like this. How do builders and developers react to conservation overlays? Are they included in this conversation?
We have a mixture of reactions, and that's why we spent years and years working with developers and architects and builders to try to find ways to not harm them, but for them to help the neighborhood do things better. And so, Rafael said about compromise, that's really important. and that's why we had people test what our overlays might do, and that really helped inform things for us.
I have a couple of questions about homelessness. There are less and less public spaces for indigenous people to dwell. How do we ameliorate the plight of people who are experiencing homelessness? I don't know how that's relevant, but there are quite a few questions about it. And does this preclude people from?
That's a wholesale change of American society, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The question earlier about affordability and whatnot, you would have to put so many mechanisms of do so much social engineering to actually make healthy neighborhoods the way they should be that it won't fall into the zoning code. I'm sorry, it's a whole bunch of things. But because one of the problems in say, HUNI's area is it was a law. It was a very highly affordable area, 2 to 3 decades ago. And as it gentrified, not only are you losing the housing stock for affordable households, but you lose laundromats and affordable restaurants and affordable groceries and a whole bunch of other amenities that serve the community to the point where it becomes cost prohibitive to stay even if you have an affordable place to live. And so, Tim and I worked hard for the last 2 years to get a substantial affordable housing project in Highland. And while it scores well for affordable housing because of the change that has occurred there, and it'll be a great opportunity for those 56 families when it gets built. There is very, very few places that are walkable that will be affordable for those households. So it is, and those are all the predicates for ending up homeless. If we don't do it at every level and all systems, we can address it, and it's a bigger problem than zoning. Sorry.
Here is another specific project question. Habitat for Humanity does great work, but the design of their buildings doesn't appear to harmonize with historic architecture. Can a COD and design overlay improve this?
Yes. Within reason.
Yeah. Please, maybe you can help answer this. Please explain the testing process of the COD.
Well, our test was, again, being a land use committee, we knew who was working in our neighborhood, and so we wrote the language and we handed it out to specific people and asked them to test things. We tested it ourselves, those of us who are design professionals on the committee. So the zoning code is a very complicated document, as you all recognize, I'm sure. And so you have to test something, you take a specific location and you say, okay, here's a site, here's a typical site, it's a 50-foot lot or it's a lot and a half, 125 feet deep, and here are the new rules. Show me what you can build there and design it. And not that they're going to design the whole thing, but they're going to do a massing study and try to see, does that help or hurt, and what are the results? And so our documentation eventually that we took to the neighborhood showed our tests. And in fact, we hired Dick Farley to do this, to test specific ones in the landmark district to see if we were getting it right.
We also did that on the slot home text amendment. 3 of the sort of most, I'll just say it, 3 of the worst developers in Denver as far as product is concerned were on that. And, it's just do your worst. Let's see how bad we can make it,
You said do your best, didn't you?
Yeah. And they did, and then we tweaked, and unfortunately, they could still make some pretty bad stuff. Thanks.
Rafael, I hope that you can answer this question. Historic Denver's initiative Discover Denver began its survey of historical Denver properties in Globeville a number of years ago. What role is the Discover Denver's database playing in helping advocate for conservation overlay? How do we access their findings for our neighborhoods?
So it's a wonderful tool if your neighborhood has been surveyed, because part of your, step one is problem definition. And so the more data you can have as far as, how, what your existing building forms are and what the prevalence is of any sort of pattern, the easier it is to sort of define a problem and make a solution that conforms. So Harkness Heights was one of those early neighborhoods, and they're moving right along in their overlays with CPD right now. So yes, I would say reach out to Historic Denver.
Or me. I can connect. we yes, the historic, that data is great for informing an overlay. That can help with identifying some of those found patterns you're trying to preserve. So if you're lucky enough that they've surveyed your neighborhood and you want to use that to help develop an overlay, then you can reach out to Historic Denver or our office. We both can help connect you with the data for your neighborhood.
In the neighborhood planning process, character and preservation is referred to. Is a COD the tool that they're referring to?
One of many tools.
This is another specific question on design. How did slot homes come to be, and what role did CPD have in their in their rise to fame?
I'd say the simple way of describing it is that there were zoning standards. There was not enough testing. It's a great example of in 2010. We wrote. If you look at the outcomes in the form-based code, where you have like example, we always saw like example kind of like massings of the kind of buildings you might get in different zone districts. In the zone districts where you most commonly saw and still see, unfortunately, slot homes being developed, it was just like unintended loopholes that allowed for people to come into. It's usually narrower lots and load a bunch of units on those long kind of narrow, deep lots that don't front the street. And so there's not enough testing and understanding of kind of what I would say bad actors wanted to do with the code. And it's why, thank God for partnership with Councilman Espinoza. We took the time to engage the people that were building them and the people that didn't like them and everybody at the table and come up with solutions. You still see a lot of them getting built because there was a lot of projects. It takes a long time to change zoning. There are a lot of projects that are already permitted in the door. And then there was a grace period for a lot of projects. And it takes a lot of time from just designing to when you actually see things getting built. So sadly, there's still projects getting constructed right now that are under the old rules before we change them. But that's why, the zoning code was broken and had loopholes we just didn't know were there until we started seeing these things come out of the ground.
Okay, I'm going to try to roll the last questions up into one before you have to go. So feel free to take more than a minute. These questions have to do with compliance and who is actually overseeing this. One is who, when overlay plans are adopted, who governs them, and is there an evolution? One of the questions had to do with a concern that they help protect a neighborhood, but neighborhoods evolve. And do you amend a COD as your neighborhood evolves? Who do you go to amend it? Is this even possible?
So the process of amending is the same as the process of creation. So it can be changed, but you have to go essentially through the similar legwork. It's the exact same legal process and council process. So again, that's why you want to be sensible with your solutions, and that's why only sensible solutions would actually get through the process. There was something else there, I forgot.
Compliance.
Compliance. So the conservation overlay it lives in the zoning code. So it's enforced the same way all zoning is, which is when you come to the city to try to build something, it gets reviewed against the zoning code. Sounds like some of our staff still need reminders to review against the overlay and not just the base zone districts. We continue to work on improving that. But you can't get a permit to build something that isn't in compliance with your overlay in the zoning code.
Yeah. So it's important that once you guys create it, to Tim's point and to what Sarah just said, that you are mindful of what it means and things of projects that are going through the hopper. Because yeah, I've been sitting at many of Tim's meetings where somebody's like, I've got to do what? They were never told, you know, and you know, I had one in my neighborhood where we put in a waiver to ban a slot home in a mixed, so the same problem we were talking about at Tennyson. And the property owner who did that with us then sold the property, and immediately the next guy came in with a slot home that was one step away from approval for his permit when it was caught. When we basically said, hey, we understand you guys are going to approve this, and you should probably look at the waivers that prevent this. And so it's going to be diligence, because there are these things are still getting missed.
All right, I know that you have to go, so maybe just last comments.
I wasn't really prepared to make parting comments, but
I can ask you another question.
glad
too.
to be glad to be here. Please reach out to our office with any additional questions that you have. And like I said, don't forget to take handouts. And we look forward to working with everybody in coming years on the bigger project to try and solve a lot of this citywide instead of neighborhood by neighborhood.
Can you provide us with those? We can put those on the website. Is that?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely send
That way,
PDFs.
if there's not enough handouts, you can find it on the website.
And the slideshow also, is that possible?
Yep, that's what we missed.
Okay, great. Yep, thanks. Departing words of wisdom and hope.
Overlays are a great tool. They can be done. It takes a lot of legwork and a lot of discussion with an awful lot of people that you'll have to educate along the way. And it's a great journey, and the results are worth it.
So there's the fact that you have overlays in Curtis Park and in HUNI are sort of no accident. One of the things that maybe you picked up on, but we haven't talked about, is who's leading that effort. Tim is is an incredible resource and has been in their planning and zoning committee for 34 years. And he runs a great meeting. He's very respectful. I wish I had an ounce of what he has, and knows how to say no tersely, and how to say no nicely as well, and still and to lead to the people along and to teach. So I can't stress enough how important it is that your leadership on any effort come from a sincere place, come to it open to compromise, and understand that it ultimately will be a political process, and that no one in that process, whether it's an R&O member, a council person, or CPD, wants to see you fail. But if you don't approach it the right way, you will. And it will take a very long time. And it is, and so if you can find a Tim, preferably with some architectural background or some legal background or something like that, it would help immensely. And make it, because it's going to be a lot of late nights, a lot of missed dinners, to complete it. And that just, sorry, I'm rambling the way I do, but it is just so important that you find the right people who are willing to be open and share that information and get that feedback whether they like it or not.
Thanks so much to our panelists, and thanks for having me. And
I really want to thank you all for being here. If you have any more questions, we can go ahead and take those online, and we'll go ahead and try and have the panelists answer those questions again. I really appreciate all your questions, your concerns, and hopefully this will help you kind of guide you a little bit, and now you have some people who you can contact, hopefully, too. So that's good to know. The other thing is that, and I just want to put this out there, INC has small grants. I don't know if Hank is still here, but we have small grants, and if you do a in-kind amount, it can help with the mailing, because we know that's pretty expensive, clearly. So that's something that you might want to keep in mind, that you can apply for a grant through INC, and that's something, and there's an application process, and that may be something that would help you with the mailing. I want to thank Stapleton United Neighbors. Thank you so much for all your effort and for being here. Thank you for Denver Public Library. That was really wonderful to have this space. Thanks again to Annie Kimmerling. The other thing is that INC is looking for board members for our next term. So if there's anybody interested, clearly you can see the value of some of the things that we provide. There are some upcoming meetings that you heard earlier. Look on the website if you didn't get the location or the times. Really important: transportation, ZAP, zoning and planning, parks, education. As Amy said, we're always looking for other members on the education committee. And also, as our sustainability committee is going into the community more. So also, please come and attend any of those meetings. Like I said, those are very important for us to have you be involved, and it's nice to see so many people here and have people involved in issues that affect all of us as residents of the city and county of Denver. And then the last thing is, I want to just wish everybody a happy holiday season. Our next delegate meeting will be January 12th, 2020. Look for the invitations to our dinner, because that'll be great, and we'd love to have some donations for the silent auction also. The meeting on January 12th, 2020 will be at Southwest Improvement Council in West Denver, location you can find on our website. Thank you very much.